Over time, the global narrative surrounding slavery has primarily focused on the transatlantic trade, which involved American and European merchants. This trade, involving British, Portuguese, Dutch, French, Spanish, and Danish from Denmark participants, saw the oceanic transport of millions of African men, women, and children. Spanning from the mid-16th century to the 1860s, this trade resulted in the enslavement and transportation of over 15 million Africans to the Americas. Sadly, only a fraction, estimated at 10 to 12 million, survived the treacherous journey across the sea to endure lives marked by grueling labor, discrimination, and abuse. While the transatlantic slave trade is extensively documented and taught in educational curricula, another form of slavery, equally catastrophic, has remained largely concealed. This lesser-known trade has often been shrouded in secrecy and at times treated as a taboo topic. However, it holds significant importance in African history due to its profound impact on the continent, its successive generations, and the way of life of its people. In this video, we delve into the Arab-Muslim slave trade, focusing particularly on the trans-Saharan slave trade. Here, Arabs engaged in the raiding, capturing, and enslavement of even their fellow Arabs and Muslims solely based on their dark skin color. We explore how Arabs justified these abhorrent actions using interpretations of verses from their holy scripture. And we also address the disheartening reality that elements of this slave trade persist in modern times. But before we dive into the fascinating depths of our video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you'll stay updated on our captivating journey through the rich tapestry of Black history. Now let's explore the Arab-Muslim slave trade, also recognized as the trans-Saharan or Eastern slave trade. Spanning over 1,300 years, this trade stands as a testament to human suffering and resilience. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homeland, condemned to endure unimaginable hardships in foreign lands. Scholars have labeled it a veiled genocide, highlighting the horrific ordeals slaves faced, from the moment of capture, through the dehumanizing slave markets, to backbreaking labor and perilous journeys. Though the exact number of enslaved Africans in the trans-Saharan trade remains debated, most experts estimate around 9 million were subjected to this brutality. The roots of this trade trace back millennia to the era of ancient Egypt's King Sneferu, who ventured into modern-day Sudan to capture slaves. Throughout history, conquests and battles in the Nile Valley and beyond saw countless individuals forced into bondage. Even the mighty Nubians fell victim to enslavement by the Egyptians. The Garamantes, an ancient Libyan civilization, prospered by exploiting the labor of sub-Saharan slaves to sustain their society. Herodotus, the renowned Greek historian, documented their brutal treatment of Ethiopian troglodytes, forcefully driving them from their caves using chariots. During the early Roman Empire, the city of Lepsus established a bustling slave market to trade slaves from the Bantu African interior. By the 5th century AD, Roman Carthage engaged in the commerce of black slaves transported across the Sahara. The empire even levied customs taxes on the slave trade, indicating its significant economic importance. Black slaves were often prized as household servants for their exotic features. While some historians argue that the scale of slavery during this period surpassed medieval times due to high demand in the Roman Empire, others suggest that the trans-Saharan trade was initially limited until the introduction of camels by Arabs and Berbers, which revolutionized desert transportation. The trans-Saharan slave trade, dating back to antiquity, persisted into the Middle Ages following the 8th century conquest of North Africa. Arab, Berber, and other ethnic groups ventured into sub-Saharan Africa, driven by the lucrative slave trade. They distinguished themselves from the inhabitants across the Sahara, referring to them as Zanj or Sudan, signifying their blackness. Arabs often acquired slaves through violent raids, capturing them for perilous journeys across the Sahara to be sold as chattel in North African markets like those in Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli, and Cairo. Slaves could also be procured through purchases from local rulers or by abduction, particularly targeting Zanj children. In 1353, Ibn Battuta documented his travels with a caravan carrying 600 black female slaves destined for roles as domestics and concubines. Battuta's encounters in Mali highlighted the prevalent slave trade, where slaves were sought after as symbols of wealth, with even travelers receiving slaves as gifts of hospitality. The routes taken by slave caravans transporting slaves depended on their destination. Slaves headed to Egypt would be carried by boat down the Nile, and slaves headed to Arabia would be sent to ports on the Red Sea, such as Suakin and Asab. Slaves headed to North Africa would have to take the Saharan trade routes, which had been in use since around 1000 BC. These include routes connecting modern-day Libya to Nigeria, the Tripoli-Fezzan-Borno route connecting Libya to areas of what are today Chad and Cameroon, and the east-west route connecting Egypt to Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Kanem-Bornu was another route to North Africa, as the Kanem-Bornu Empire in the eastern part of Nigeria was an active part of the trans-Saharan slave trade for centuries, and the trade formed the basis of the empire's prosperity. Journeying through the Sahara demanded the skills of ethnic groups adapted to the harsh desert environment, such as the local Berber tribes and foreign Bedouins from Arabia. These desert dwellers, like the Tuareg indigenous to Libya, played pivotal roles in facilitating and organizing the trans-Saharan trade routes. Nomadic peoples serving as guards, guides, and camel drivers were crucial for safe passage. Their expertise earned them autonomy and favor with North African governments. Oasis settlements like Al-Jala, Ghatamis, and Kufra in Libya served as vital rest stops for caravans, facilitating both north-south and east-west travel. Despite expert assistance, the desert journey posed lethal risks to merchants and slaves alike. Entire caravans, comprising thousands, could vanish without a trace. Between AD 650 and 1600, an estimated average of 5,000 Africans were shipped out yearly by Arab traders, totaling roughly 7.25 million. From 1600 to 1800, an additional 1.4 million Africans were transported by Arabs. The 19th century marked the peak of Arabian trade, with an annual shipment of 12,000 Africans. In that century alone, 1.2 million slaves were sent to Arabia. Comparatively, Arabia's 9.85 million enslaved individuals closely rivals the conservative estimate of nearly 12 million victims of the Atlantic slave trade. Some African historians contest these figures, arguing that over 50 million Africans were traded in the Atlantic alone. Additionally, around 4.1 million Africans were transported across the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf and India, primarily facilitated by Muslim traders. Throughout the 19th century, Omani Arab rulers of Zanzibar dispatched hundreds of thousands of African slaves to toil on clove plantations, a practice that continued even after Europe and America abolished their slave trades. This persistence of slavery underscored the nefariousness of Arab slavers, who continued their trade into the 20th century. Today, Arab slavers still operate in Sudan and Mauritania, perpetuating a Middle Passage as horrifying as its Atlantic counterpart. The Middle Passage describes the harrowing journey lasting several months from Africa's west coast to the Americas, during which millions of Africans packed like sardines in the slave ships died of thirst, hunger, rough seas, and sometimes from the sheer brutality inflicted by the European slavers. In the Arabian trade, the trudge across the Sahara in leg and neck chains, and necks in large forked sticks, and hands tied with bark thongs was particularly harsh on the African slaves. The hardships of these long marches across the desert were considerable, and much later travelers reported that the routes were lined with the parched skeletons of those who succumbed to exhaustion and thirst along the way. Arab slavers didn't just transport African captives to Arabia, they sometimes sold them to European traders as well. Crafty Arab merchants would gather in Zanzibar to procure raw materials like cloves and ivory, often buying black slaves to transport these goods and work on plantations abroad. These slaves, sourced from regions as distant as Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia, were auctioned in the Zanzibar market and shipped across the Indian Ocean to destinations like the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Peninsula, where they were forced into labor in places like Oman, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. Initially, African Muslims were exempt from enslavement due to Islamic legal principles. However, this changed rapidly. Meanwhile, the trans-Saharan caravan routes focused on West Africa, stretching from the Niger Valley to the Gulf of Guinea, leading to slave markets in regions like Maghreb and the Nile Basin. This arduous journey, lasting up to 3 months, subjected slaves to brutal conditions, resulting in many perishing from disease, hunger, or thirst along the way. It's estimated that half of all slaves in this trade died during transit. European explorers from the 19th century recounted their harrowing experiences traveling alongside these slave caravans. Gustav Nachtigall, an explorer, discovered numerous bones at dried-up desert springs, estimating that for every slave who reached the market, 3 or 4 had died or escaped. Cold weather also proved lethal, with Heinrich Barth recounting how the Vizier of Bornu lost 40 slaves in a single night. British accounts in Libya describe finding 100 skeletons. Contrary to the popular image of male slaves toiling on New World plantations, the reality of servitude was often manifested in the forced migration of countless young women and girls across the Sahara and the Horn of Africa into the confines of Islamic concubinage. While in the European New World, a man's worth was often measured by his ability to perform strenuous labor, in the Islamic Orient, wealth was often equated with status. Consequently, many women slaves in the Arab world were transformed into concubines, residing in harems and rarely attaining the status of wives, while their offspring were typically granted freedom. Numerous male slaves and young boys suffered castration, becoming eunuchs tasked with overseeing the harems. Castration, an immensely brutal procedure, resulted in a survival rate of just 10%. These eunuchs, valued around 7 times more than intact males, served as administrators, tutors, secretaries, commercial agents, and sometimes even as concubines themselves. Due to strictures within Islamic law, slaves would not usually be castrated within Muslim territory, and therefore would be castrated before being sent across the Sahara. Sometimes slaves were castrated after purchase in North African slave markets. While the Europeans paid a higher price for male slaves than females, the reverse was the case with the Arabs. Moreover, while the European slavers profited mainly from male labor, the Arabs saw profit in sexual satisfaction and reproductive potential. Slavery in Africa had a profound impact on population growth and gender dynamics, particularly during the Arab slave trade. Despite not being primarily driven by economic motives, this trade heavily disrupted demographics and led to significant economic decline by exploiting the reproductive capacity of targeted regions. Lasting for 13 centuries without pause, the Arab raids into sub-Saharan Africa resulted in the disappearance of countless men due to brutal treatment. This dark chapter in Black history continues to cast a shadow. In the medieval Muslim culture, blackness became closely associated with slavery, justified by a selective interpretation of the biblical story of Ham's curse. According to this interpretation, Ham's descendants were condemned to slavery, with blackness being seen as a sign of this curse. This pretext was used by Muslim slave traders to justify the enslavement of black individuals, including fellow Muslims. In the late 14th century, a black king from Bornu wrote to the Sultan of Egypt, decrying the relentless slave raids by Arab tribes that devastated his lands and led to the enslavement of many black Muslims. Even in Al-Andalus, the Islamic-controlled region of medieval Iberia, black Muslims could legally be held as slaves. This contradicted the Orthodox Muslim stance that no Muslim, regardless of race, should be enslaved. Despite this, as late as the 19th century, a significant portion of Islamic society believed that enslavement based on skin color, rather than religious affiliation, was sanctioned by Islamic law. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Central Africa faced relentless raids by slave traders, contributing to the expansion of Saharan and Nile River slave routes. These captives were shipped to various destinations, including the Mediterranean coast, Europe, Arabia, the Western Hemisphere, and slave ports along the African coasts. Although Tripoli officially abolished the slave trade in 1853, it persisted until the 1890s. Despite Europe and the United States ending their involvement in the African slave trade centuries ago, Arab countries continued it, with some ceasing only in the late 20th century. Slavery was outlawed in Malawi in 2007, yet reports suggest clandestine involvement of certain Arab countries. By 1858, over 2/3 of Sahara's trade value comprised of slaves, as noted by the British consul in Tripoli. The trade expanded exponentially, with slaves fetching quadruple prices in markets like Alexandria and Constantinople, often with government encouragement. By the mid-19th century, nearly 10,000 slaves were being transported yearly to North Africa. Efforts to combat slavery included the establishment of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society in 1839. Tunis outlawed slavery in 1846, and France followed suit in Algeria in 1848. However, slavery persisted in Mauritania until 1981. Since the Libyan civil war in 2011, Libya has been destabilized, becoming a hub for migrants heading to Europe. Shockingly, Reports by the International Organization for Migration revealed that many West African migrants are sold as slaves after being detained by smugglers or militias. These victims, often with valuable skills, face torture, forced labor, and sexual abuse until their families pay ransom. Women are particularly vulnerable, often sold into brothels or private clients' hands. Many child migrants also suffer from abuse and child rape in Libya. After receiving unverified CNN video of a November 2017 slave auction in Libya, a human trafficker told Al Jazeera that hundreds of migrants are bought and sold across the country every week. There were other confirmed reports of slavery in Libya by Arabs in the 21st century. A Libyan group known as the Asma Boys have antagonized migrants from other parts of Africa from at least as early as 2000, destroying their property. Nigerian migrants in January 2018 gave accounts of abuses in detention centers, including being leased or sold as slaves. Videos of Sudanese migrants being burnt and whipped for ransom were released later on by their families on social media. In June 2018, the United Nations applied sanctions against 4 Libyans, including a Coast Guard commander and 2 Eritreans, for their criminal leadership of slave trade networks. While the world moved towards recognizing the devastation caused by slavery and took steps to abolish it, the Arab world resisted, requiring significant international pressure and slave revolts to bring it to an end. Surprisingly, many African authors have refrained from addressing the Arab-Muslim slave trade, often out of religious solidarity, especially considering Africa's sizable Muslim population of 500 million. Instead, it's often easier to place blame on the West rather than confront the past crimes of Arab Muslims. Reflecting on history reveals the horrors endured during the Arab slave trade, the countless lives lost in desert crossings, and the unspeakable torture awaiting those who reach their destinations. Yet this dark chapter remains largely overlooked, shrouded in secrecy. However, understanding this past is crucial as its effects persist today. Sadly, the echoes of this brutality persist in modern times. In some Arab African countries, the grim legacy of slavery endures, with migrants seeking better lives being ensnared in bondage and sold to the highest bidder. It's imperative that we unite to address this ongoing injustice. By acknowledging this hidden history and engaging in open dialogue, we can begin to enact positive change. Education is key. By spreading awareness and advocating for those who continue to suffer, we honor the resilience of those who endured the Arab-Muslim slave trade. Their strength in the face of adversity serves as a testament to the human spirit. Together, by pledging to eradicate slavery in all its forms, we demonstrate our commitment to justice, equality, and creating a world of compassion for all. Join us in amplifying the voices and stories of Black individuals. Every like, share, comment, and subscription makes a difference in spreading awareness and celebrating the rich diversity of Black experiences. By engaging with our content, you're helping to shine a spotlight on stories that deserve to be heard, empowering Black voices, and fostering a more inclusive world. Let's come together to inspire, educate, and uplift one another. Together, we can make a meaningful impact and create positive change. So hit that like button, share with your friends and family, leave a comment to join the conversation, and don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on our journey of discovery and enlightenment. Thank you for your support in spreading the stories of Black people far and wide.